Hi, Mr. Fernandez here. I hope you had a happy new year and a wonderful break. I'm here to tell you a bit today about the Second Industrial Revolution, which can be said to have happened between 1865 and 1898, roughly when the Civil War, around the time when the Civil War ended, and through the rest of the 19th century. Your learning target is that by the end of this recorded lecture, you'll be able to describe the causes and key elements of the Second Industrial Revolution after the U.S. Civil War. First, let me tell you a bit about what the Second Industrial Revolution was, what was happening in the second half of the 19th century that historians look back and call the Second Industrial Revolution. Some graphs will help us put this paint this picture. Check out the gross domestic product. For those of you who don't remember economics from last year, the gross domestic product is the aggregate of all economic activity in the at least the worth of that economic activity in a given country. Gross domestic product allows us to look at generally how well an economy is doing. So here you have a graph that shows you the United States, the United Kingdom of Great Britain, Germany, and France. These were the four great industrial economies of the 19th century. And look at the trajectory here. Starting with 1870, the beginning of this graph, you'll notice that the United States is kind of on a par with these European industrializing economies. And then you'll notice that by the end of the 19th century, by 1900, the United States has pulled away from these countries in the worth of its economy. The United States by 1900 has become the world's economic superpower, if you will, the economic powerhouse of the world, the biggest, most valuable economy in the world. This is the population of these industrialized countries. We're adding Italy here to the mix. Most of them European countries, and then the U.S. And you'll notice that as well as along with the gross domestic product, that the population of the United States also takes off compared to these other countries. And by 1908, the United States, or even before that, by the end of the 19th century, the United States has become the most populous of the major industrialized nations in the Western world. Another thing to kind of help paint this picture of the Second Industrial Revolution is what kind of work people were doing in the United States in this time period. And you'll notice that at the beginning of this time period, in 1860, more people were farming than doing anything else. By the end of this time period, more people are engaged in manufacturing and industry than farming. So for the first time in United States history, by 1900, a trend that begins before the Civil War but really explodes after the Civil War is that the United States has transitioned from a primarily agrarian or agricultural economy to an industrial economy focused on the production of goods and services as opposed to crops. And then finally, you'll notice that the population of the American cities also see a gigantic transformation during this time period. In 1860, fewer than 5 million or so people lived in cities. By 1890, more than 20 million people lived in cities. And by 1920, that number saw an enormous increase, a threefold increase almost, to over 50 million people. So the United States has become not yet more urban than rural, but far more urban than it was at the beginning of the Civil War, thanks to the Second Industrial Revolution. So, the Second Industrial Revolution is often compared to the industrialization that we've already talked about that happened before the Civil War. So you have to think back to, October or so, when we talked about the first industrial revolution. We also referred to it as the market revolution, a time when more and more Americans were beginning to work in factories, when more and more Americans were beginning to work to live in cities, and when there was a revolution, you might say, in transportation and in whatchamacallit, in technology. And so it's important to kind of make a distinction then between the pre-Civil War industrialization and the industrialization that took place after the Civil War during this time period that is often referred to as the Gilded Age. Before the Civil War, for example, one point of comparison is what kinds of things were being produced in the industrial economy or in the industrial sector of the economy. You'll notice that before the Civil War, mostly textiles, cotton goods, things like that were dominated the industrializing or the industrial sector of the economy. Whereas after the Civil War, you get more modern things like steel, petroleum, so that's oil, the refinement, the extraction and refinement of petroleum. Big industrial machines are being made that can make other goods in vast quantities, cheaply and efficiently. And then finally, a whole bunch of consumer goods are being made in the last half of the 19th century. Among those consumer goods are the telephone. In the 1870s, as you'll see, another technological or communications revolution takes place when the telephone is invented and becomes widely used. This is to be contrasted with the pre-Civil War era, when the big innovation then was the telegraph. Similarly, before the Civil War, the factories were powered primarily by water, moving water, rushing water, and also steam once the steam engine was developed. On the other hand, during the post-Civil War era, factories were now being powered by petroleum, which allows for much more powerful factories. And later, when electricity in the last half of the 19th century, in the last 2 decades of the 19th century, is invented and becomes used more widely, factories are powered now by electricity, which of course is far more powerful than water or steam power. Before the Civil War, you had a transportation revolution that included the building of canals, and starting with the Erie Canal, most notably, and many, many other canals around the country, as well as the widespread use of the steam engine on river boats, especially, to make the movement of goods and people across the country much more cheap and efficient. After the Civil War, something that started before the Civil War really exploded after the Civil War, and that was the development of railroads, which proliferated all around the country, much faster than even canals, even steamboats. Before the Civil War, the workforce was still mostly agricultural. More and more people were working in factories, but still it was something like 20% of people by the Civil War were employed in non-agricultural pursuits. By the end of the 1800s, by 1900, as a result of the Second Industrial Revolution, there are more industrial workers now than there are independent farmers. America has become more industrialized than agrarian by this point. That's a major transition in American history. And similarly, before the Civil War, only about 20% of people lived in cities. This was a dramatic increase at the time. But by the end of the 19th century, after the Civil War, urbanization really exploded to the point where 40% of people lived in cities by that point. So in some cases, it's a difference in degrees, the degree of urbanization, the degree of the amount of workers or number of workers who are employed in the industrial sector. And in other cases, it's a matter of substantive differences, like the difference between the kinds of fuels used during this time, which led to very different amounts of output in industrial production, the difference in the technology, and the difference in the kinds of goods being produced as well, is something you can say is a major difference between pre-Civil War and post-Civil War industrialization. Anyway, let's talk about what were the causes of the Second Industrial Revolution. Why did this all happen? Why was there this explosion in new kinds of technology? Once again, why was there an explosion in the size of the industrial workforce? Why was there an explosion in the urban population? Why was there an explosion in the economic output of this country after the Civil War? And you can say that there are four major causes of the Second Industrial Revolution. There they are. I'm going to talk about each one by one. The first major cause of the Industrial Revolution, of the Second Industrial Revolution, is the business-friendly governments. The government, the federal and local and state governments had a lot to do with it, and here's why. Number one, the federal government, which is in charge of tariffs or taxes on imported goods, continued to have, with the Republican Party at the helm most of the time during this period, tariffs that were designed to protect American manufacturing, so from competition with European manufacturers. So that's one important reason. The government was protecting American industrialists, letting them produce goods and services with less competition from European producers than they otherwise would have if it weren't for those tariffs. Also, corporations, which are becoming huge, as you'll see soon during this time period, are also enjoying very, very low taxes in this early period of corporate development. So they get to keep their money and develop and use that money to invest in production and innovation. Very few regulations on commerce on the part of the federal government and the state government. This was a time period when it wasn't yet en vogue for governments in the U.S. to regulate the economy in any real way. It'll start to change during this time period, but the general theme during this period is one of laissez-faire, or hands off the economy. And finally, kind of in a bit of an ironic twist, despite the posture of laissez-faire or having few regulations on the economy on the part of the federal government or state and local governments, the Republicans in power during and after the Civil War did interject the government in one important way into the economy, and that is by supporting the development of railroad and telegraph companies with loans and other government support, including land grants, so giving corporations land, public land that belongs to the federal government on behalf of the people for free or very cheap, in order to, as a way of encouraging development of railroad and telegraph lines. So here you have that a picture of that, a map that shows you just how much public land was given by the federal government to 80 railroad companies during this time period. That's basically free land given to these companies. The idea was, if the federal government gives them the land, and in return they build railroads through that land. They own the land that they build the railroads through, or a few miles on either side of the railroad tracks. That allows them to sell the land to people as they develop the railroads and make a big profit. And it also gives them an incentive, railroad companies, an incentive to build these railroad lines, because it's guaranteed profit the sale of these western lands to people as they build the railroads. So that's a big, big, big important part of the picture here. America, in part, this vast industrial economy was built in part as a result of the largesse of the federal government, the generosity of the federal government, the interest in the federal government to develop the economy by giving money, basically, to private businesses. This is kind of like the Hamiltonian dream, right? Come true. The old Whig dream, the Republican Party kind of, remember, assumed the old Whig ideals of government stimulation of the economy, so here you see that happening in full force. An example of this is the Pacific Railroad Acts in the 1860s, during and after the Civil War, which basically gave money to railroad companies to construct a transcontinental railroad. And by 1869, there is now a railroad linking all of the country from east to west, thanks to federal government's generosity. Here is a result of that. The total railroad mileage in the U.S. explodes during this time period. As does the railway workforce as well. So that's number one. Number two, second big reason why the economy explodes and there's a second industrial revolution is because of growing access to resources and the development of new markets. Let me explain that. So here's a map of the United States around 1890. Oh yeah, it's 1890. And notice those lines, of course, are railroad lines. And one thing, of course, that you can also notice is that all of the continental U.S. is now populated and reachable, right, by railroads. So one big part of the picture after the Civil War is that now that the U.S. has acquired all the territory, continental territory it's going to have for moving forward. The story after the Civil War is the peopling of those territories out west, especially, and the access to the resources in those territories by people living in the east and the eastern parts of the country, including corporations. Before I go on, I want to, kind of point out that one way to conceptualize the geography of the United States during this time period is to divide it up into sort of four big zones. The Northeast and the Midwest, which continues to be the economic, or the industrial rather, center of the country. The South, which continues to be an agrarian, mostly agricultural, but changing part of the country. The West, which is the kind of newest part of the country where the population is growing rapidly. And then the Great Plains, remember the Kansas and Nebraska? This is the kind of the last part of the country to truly be developed because it was the less desirable land, thin soil, rocky soil, dry climate, and so it took a lot for people to be encouraged to move there. And it took a lot of technological innovation to make farming there possible, and a lot of infrastructure investment in, irrigation, for example, infrastructure. Anyway, the railroad development that I talked about in the last few minutes had a lot to do with the second industrial revolution. As the country became moved... Oh, you gotta be kidding me. Hello? Nice. Well, PowerPoint just froze on me, but I'm gonna soldier on, man. I'm not gonna let this get me down. So let me go back to where we were. I hate you, PowerPoint, so much. my arch enemy. Anyway, the railroad development that I talked about into the western parts of this country allowed for access to the resources in the west that I spoke about, and that led to the further development of the Great Plains in the west. So, like I said, getting people, allowing for a way of moving people and goods and services all the way across the country, including into and out of these new territories, allows access to all kinds of resources. Those resources include mineral and natural resources like copper, silver, iron, coal, lumber. All of that is stuff that can be used in the industrial economy back in the Northeast, right, and Midwest, where all of that industrialization was really happening. And so I really want to point that out, right? Like, we often think of the West you'll see, during this time period as the West of the cowboy and the Indian, right? These vast expanses of empty land, riding off into the sunset, that kind of thing. And sure, there was some of that, but it's focusing on that very often belies the reality, which was that the West was very much integrated with the Northeast and the Midwest. The western part of the country, in fact, was one of the major fuels, if you will, of industrialization during this time period. Without the West, without the vast resources of the West, you're unlikely to have gotten this sort of level of industrialization that happens after the Civil War. So that's a thing I wanted to talk about. Of course, in new settlements in the West, as people are drawn into the West, including from abroad, right, as you'll see later on, and the population of the United States grows and grows and grows, this creates new markets for new businesses. So the development of the West, and then later, and at the same time, a little bit later, the Great Plains makes it more profitable for businesses in the Northeast and Midwest, industrializing businesses, to make more goods and services to provide to people living in these new territories. And then finally, the development of the railroad leads to enormous profit for investment in other industries. These railroad companies are some of the biggest companies in the late 1800s, and as they make a lot of money, thanks in part to the federal government giving them very, very generous subsidies and other support, free land, for example, like I mentioned before, these railroad companies end up with tons and tons of money. That money is used to fuel innovation and growth in other industries. So that's number two. Number three is, speaking of innovation, innovation was another cause of the Second Industrial Revolution. The Second Industrial Revolution is the era of the great inventors, or at least the inventors we tend to pay attention to in history, or at least in history classes, right? Thomas Edison, of course, being number one on that list. Alexander Graham Bell, George Westinghouse, these all had something to do with a number of inventions during this time period that greatly facilitated the Second Industrial Revolution. Here is the number of patents issued by the U.S. government. Notice the end of the Civil War is around here, and this is around the end of the 1800s. And you'll notice that there's an explosion of patent issuance, and that means that there's an explosion of inventions during this time period. These technological innovations make manufacturing, communication, and transportation more efficient and cheaper. And let's not forget that these innovations didn't just happen by accident. They didn't just happen because there happened to be some smart people around. They happened because there was so much money available to invest in technological innovation, thanks to the development of the railroads, for example, and other big businesses. Thomas Edison, for example, wasn't some like lonely inventor tinkering away in his garage somewhere inventing stuff just for the fun of it. He was a fabulously wealthy inventor who received tons and tons of money before he went off on his own from corporations who would pay for his inventions and for this vast staff that he would use in New Jersey in Menlo Park to help him come up with new innovations on a yearly basis. This was not an accident. This was not just like one smart dude. This was a whole industry bent on innovation. So here's Thomas Edison again, who is responsible for things like the light bulb or the incandescent light bulb, phonograph, right? An early version of the video camera, and film camera, and things like that. And of course, he helped to make possible the use of electricity in for industrial uses, and then later on for residential use. Of course, there's this whole big debate about whether it was Thomas Edison or Nikola Tesla who was most responsible for modern electricity. If you are interested in a little fun rap battle between the two to determine who was more important in the development of electricity, feel free to follow that link and enjoy. So that's one. Then there's the transatlantic telegraph cable. So by 1866, the United States is not only crisscrossed by telegraph lines, but it also is now connected to the rest of the world thanks to underground or underwater telegraph cables laid between the northeast of the U.S. and Europe. But then more importantly comes Alexander Graham Bell's telephone in 1876, which revolutionizes business, among other things, right? If the telegraph made it possible for very, very quick communication, the telephone made communication even more rapid and more efficient. You didn't have to use Morse code to send messages anymore. You could actually speak to somebody on the other end of the telephone. In the same way that the internet has made American businesses today vastly different than they were just 20 years ago, the telephone had an enormous effect on the second industrial revolution as well, and business innovations. Other technological innovations included innovations in steel making. The railroad lines that crisscross the United States that could carry bigger and bigger loads, bigger and bigger rail cars, were made possible by stronger material thanks to the Bessemer steelmaking process. Not just that, but the skyscrapers that you begin seeing constructed during this time period in the major cities are also made possible by stronger material, stronger steel, thanks to the Bessemer steelmaking process. You cannot ignore the importance of the Bessemer steelmaking process and the importance of iron and steel production in the last half of the 19th century as a driver of the industrializing economy. The fountain pen, a handheld camera invented by this dude named Kodak. A razor that didn't cut your face up when you used it, and you could use it on yourself. These kinds of things became very, very popular consumer items, and were part of this second industrial revolution. All of which led to an enormous output thanks to greater innovation in production, greater output thanks to greater demand for consumer goods, like things like the fountain pen and the handheld cameras. And so it contributed to this vast increase in the gross domestic product during this time period. Another thing that was part of innovation is not the kind of like technology but more innovation in how businesses operated. Um, uh, Generally, during this time period, you see a big transformation in the operation of businesses and the management of businesses to make them more efficient and more profitable. There's what some call a managerial revolution, for example, where businesses become bigger and also develop departments in order to specialize and increase efficiency. So, an engineering department, a marketing department, but staffed by people who are experts in trying to get people to buy, goods and services. An accounting department, and so and so on and so forth. The gathering of data to make the flow of goods, the optimal workforce, sales, etc., increases efficiency and profits as well. So businesses become very modern, I guess, is the point here, using modern bureaucratic strategies to streamline their operations, to make them more efficient, and therefore more profitable. But perhaps the most important innovation during this time period is consolidation. Often referred to back then as combinations, disparagingly as monopolies. Businesses began to see in a big market like the United States, and especially if you're making stuff for either the whole U.S. or market or even beyond outside of the U.S., it became more and more attractive and appealing to develop bigger and bigger structures, business structures, with the use of two big trends during this time period: horizontal integration and vertical integration, both of which led to the development of very, very large businesses with a national footprint, right? Businesses that were no longer local exclusively or even regional exclusively, but now operated in all of the country and sometimes abroad as well, with tens of thousands of workers that were often worth hundreds of millions or billions of dollars. So basically, like the corporations that we have today, only not yet as giant as something like Google or Microsoft or AT&T. But this is when you start getting these big, giant corporations. They're starting to develop during this time period because there is profit in consolidation. So anyway, vertical integration, horizontal integration are the two big strategies being devised during this time period. Vertical integration is when a business decides that it makes sense for that business to own and control every aspect of the production process. So, for example, Ace Meat Industries might decide that instead of just having the meat packing plants where they process the meat and package it to be sold in markets locally and beyond, that it would make sense for them to own everything that leads up to that process, from the cows and the farms on which they're raised, to the slaughterhouses, to the railroad cars on which they're transported, to the warehouses in which they're stored, to the meat packing plants and the delivery wagons that then take the meat to market. If you control all of that, then you control costs, and you don't have to compete with other businesses to try to make a profit. Horizontal integration is another version of this. Only instead of whereas vertical integration is all about owning the production process from the very beginning to the very end and beyond, horizontal integration is owning all of the competition in a particular part of the production process. So, for example, U.S. Oil Company was an oil refining company at the time in the 19th century, very large one, and its its way to success was buying out other oil refining companies that were owned by small business, by families, or by smaller companies. In order to, and by buying them all up, U.S. Oil eliminated the competition, and by eliminating the competition, they eliminated they basically controlled the prices for goods and services that they produced. All of this consolidation, the development of combinations, of monopolies, often also called trusts, although trusts are a little bit different, but kind of the same sort of idea. Started with railroads. Cornelius Vanderbilt, for example, you might have heard that name because this was one of the wealthiest people in the country at the time, whose wealth came primarily from railroads. In part, became so wealthy because of the efforts to buy out and control as many railroad lines as possible to reduce competition, so that his company could, or his companies could, basically dictate prices without having to worry about anybody else offering services at a lower price. So they win everyone's business as a result. That's Vanderbilt on the left, who made his millions in the railroad industry. There's J.P. Morgan in the middle, who made his millions in steel and banking. And then there's Andrew Carnegie, who also made his millions in steel. These are people who all practiced that new innovation of horizontal and vertical integration to create these giant businesses and dominate the market in a certain product. These were the men who built America, right? According to the History Channel, they're often revered as great innovators, great entrepreneurs. We'll talk a little bit more about whether you agree with that analysis when we come back to class. But I'd be remiss if I didn't mention perhaps the most notorious of these businesses that became successful, huge businesses as a result of attempting to dominate a certain market and creating monopolies. And that's, of course, Standard Oil Company. John D. Rockefeller, you know him. Probably you've heard his name. Again, one of the wealthiest people in the country at the time. His family continues to have a great deal of wealth, and that wealth was gotten by investment in and work in the oil industry, the petroleum industry. Standard Oil was the giant of the oil industry, practicing horizontal integration, buying up all of the other businesses that tried to, or as many as possible, to try to that also produced oil and sold it on the market. Now remember, oil was super important. Oil was something that fueled factories, but also was kind of like everyday fuel for people before electricity, especially. It's what you use to light your home with, candles, and that were fueled by oil. It was heating. It's how you got your heating in the winter. So very, very important business. Standard Oil, by the middle of this period, controlled 90% of America's oil industry. That made Rockefeller one of the richest men in the world, with a net worth of $900 million, and it made Standard Oil Company one of the biggest companies in the world, really, with 60,000 employees. Finally, other innovations included innovations in marketing. Mass marketing. So with these companies that become national in nature, that operate all over the country and even abroad, you get, along with that, the development of mass marketing techniques. Now you have to appeal to as many people as possible in as many places as possible. And so you have companies that become really, really good at selling stuff all over the country. For example, Sears. Now, you know Sears is like this crappy little store that is in some of the most, depressing malls in the area and is on its way out. But Sears was like the Amazon of the late 1800s. People could, you'd get a Sears and Roebuck catalog. You could buy just about anything, and then Sears would sell it for cheaper than you could probably buy it anywhere else, because they took advantage of the efficient production techniques. They took advantage of efficient transportation techniques. They took advantage of being a huge company so that they could buy at cheap prices and sell at lower prices than their competitors. You had Sears, you had Montgomery Ward, you had Woolworths. These were national catalog services and chain stores that are becoming big during this time period. You have national brand names that are becoming well known now. Singer sewing machines, Kellogg's cornflakes, things like that are part of the Second Industrial Revolution, which is part of a trend toward the United States becoming a national market, a homogenous market where a smaller and smaller number of companies kind of dominates the production and sale of goods and services. Anyway, finally, during this time period, another important cause of the Industrial Revolution is the growing population. You need a big population in order to make it worthwhile to produce vast amounts of goods and services, right? So you need to have people to sell that stuff to. You need a huge population in order to populate the West, which is where the United Americans will get, the entrepreneurs will get a whole bunch of resources, natural resources that are crucial to fueling the Industrial Revolution. And of course, you need labor. You need people to work in these factories. Notice how the United States population booms between 1860 and 1900 in just 40 years, just a generation and a half or so. The United States almost triples in size, or more than doubles in size in terms of its population. That much of that goes to the industrial workforce, or peoples the industrial workforce. And then much of that, of course, is also thanks to immigration. Between 1870 and 1900, the number of people who are immigrants in this country, once again, more than doubles. And is one of the reasons why we had such a big population explosion. Not the only reason, but a major reason. And so the immigrant population is also a big fueler of the Second Industrial Revolution. So, to summarize, 4 big causes of the Second Industrial Revolution: business-friendly government policies, things like subsidies for railroad companies, land grants to railroad companies and telegraph companies that facilitate private investment in railroad development. Much of that helps lead to the peopling and the growth of the population in the West, which allows access to resources and development of new markets there. A lot of innovation during this time, thanks to a great deal of investment that comes in part from the profit made by railroad companies. And other innovations during this time, especially the growth of larger and larger companies to lead to greater efficiency and profitability. And finally, people. The sheer numbers of people needed to fuel an industrial economy like this was, of course, provided by the growing population, and partly because of a huge increase in immigration. And that is why you have the Second Industrial Revolution. Oh, screw you.